My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and just a few weeks ago, I buried my sister Margaret. For 19 years, she was the steady presence in my life after my children left me. She wasn't warm in the way people imagine family should be, but she never left. She stayed, and sometimes that is the greatest form of love. The morning after the funeral, I was still putting away sympathy cards when the phone rang. It was Harold Mason, Margaret's attorney. His voice carried no softness, only formality. He said there were matters to discuss that I should come to his office downtown. I remember sitting in the car for 10 minutes before turning the key. The house already felt too big, too hollow. I wore the navy suit Margaret always said made me look like a woman with boundaries. I didn't feel strong, but I knew I had to walk through this moment. When I arrived, Harold read Margaret's will in that dry tone only lawyers seem to master. Every property, every account, every detail was left to me. My name on everything she had built and saved. I never asked for it, and I never imagined receiving it. I just wanted more time with her. But life rarely asks what we want. It hands us what is next. I was still trying to breathe when the door opened. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Standing there were Daniel, my eldest son, tall and composed, his smile too practiced. Claire, my daughter, thin and tense, her words spilling too quickly as she said, "Mom," and Michael, my youngest, quiet in the back like he had always been. 18 years had passed without a single call, a single holiday, not even a card. And now they were here, in the lawyer's office, acting as though nothing had happened. Something inside my chest tightened. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that maybe grief had softened them, but something in their eyes felt rehearsed. Something in their smiles felt calculated. I sat perfectly still, realizing in that moment that my story was about to begin again, not with reunion, but with something far more complicated. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. Harold closed the folder with a firm motion, as though the matter was settled. But nothing felt settled to me. My sister's ashes were barely cold, and now I was sitting across from 3 people who had once called me Mom, who had once been my entire world, and who had vanished without a word nearly 2 decades ago. Daniel spoke first. His voice carried that smooth tone he used even as a teenager when he wanted something. He said he was sorry for everything, that life had been complicated, that they had all made mistakes. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together as though he were delivering a business pitch instead of speaking to his mother. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, afraid that if I let go, the tremor in my fingers would betray me. Claire followed quickly. Her smile was stretched too wide, her words too sweet. She asked how I had been managing in such a large house all alone, if I was eating well, if the silence ever became too heavy. Each question sounded less like care and more like a test, as though she were feeling for weak spots. I pulled my hand back when she reached across the table. The gesture was instinctive, protective. Michael spoke last, softly, almost apologetically. He said they had read the obituary and had meant to come sooner. He didn't look me in the eye, not once. His voice trembled, but it was the kind of tremble that came from unease, not emotion. I wanted to search his face for the boy I remembered, the boy who used to trail after his older brother and sister, clutching his comic books. But that boy was gone, and in his place stood a man I hardly recognized. Harold cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the shift in the room. He reminded everyone that Margaret's estate had already been lawfully transferred, that there were no disputes to be raised. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. Claire's smile faltered, and Michael sank further into his chair. I sat there in silence, my heart pounding, realizing this was not a chance meeting. It was planned. And though they spoke of rebuilding, of second chances, what they wanted was written not in their words, but in their eyes. They were not here for me. They were here for what Margaret had left behind. As I looked at them in that polished office, another memory rose up, sharp and uninvited. It was 18 years ago, the night everything between us broke. I can still see the living room where it happened, the way the lamplight fell across the carpet, the way their voices overlapped until they were louder than my own heartbeat. Daniel stood tall, like he was the new head of the house, though he was only 24. He told me I was too controlling, that my anxieties smothered him, that I needed to give him space. His words were cold, rehearsed. It felt less like a son speaking and more like a man delivering a verdict. Claire sat on the couch, arms crossed, her face twisted in a mixture of frustration and something close to contempt. She said she couldn't carry my weight anymore, that I was draining, that I leaned on them instead of letting them live their lives. Every sentence came out clipped, like she had been waiting months to unleash it. And then there was Michael, just 19, my quiet one. He didn't speak at all. He just stared at the floor, his jaw tight, his silence heavier than any words. When he finally moved, it was only to hand me a folded blanket, placing it on the floor like a reluctant offering. He didn't even say goodbye. I didn't scream, I didn't beg. But inside, something cracked. I packed a small duffel bag with the few things I thought I might need, a jacket, a pair of shoes. My hands trembled as I zipped it shut. They watched me walk to the door as though I were a stranger. They had tolerated too long. I stepped out into the night air, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing louder than any argument we could have had. I walked 4 blocks to a gas station, unsure of where else to go. The payphone stood there like a lifeline. I dialed one number, the only number I could. My sister, Margaret. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask if I was safe. She just said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." 15 minutes later, her old sedan pulled up, headlights flickering. She unlocked the passenger door from the inside and waited. I climbed in, clutching my bag, unable to speak. She handed me a paper cup of tea she had bought at the station counter, still warm. We drove back to her house in silence. But it wasn't the silence of rejection. It was the silence of safety. That night, I slept in her guest room under a quilt she had folded herself, and though the world had just told me I was unwanted, my sister's quiet presence reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. I was not alone. Years passed in Margaret's house, and what began as a temporary refuge turned into something steadier. She never once asked when I was leaving. She never hinted that I was a guest. Instead, she made space for me, quietly, without ceremony. A key placed on the kitchen counter. My clothes moved from the guest room into the west bedroom. A grocery list written for 2 instead of 1. We never used the word family, but in her way, Margaret gave me back the feeling of belonging. Over time, I learned her rhythm. Morning walks, afternoon tea, quiet evenings with the news humming in the background. She was not affectionate, not the type to wrap me in hugs or shower me with words, but she stayed, and after everything I had lost, her staying became the one thing that mattered most. 19 years later, Margaret was gone, and her absence felt like the hollowing out of a foundation. I moved through her kitchen in a daze, touching the counter she had kept spotless, breathing in the faint trace of sandalwood and mint she favored. The will confirmed what I had never expected. She left everything to me, every acre of land, every account, every detail of her life's work, not because I had asked, not because she didn't have other options, but because, as she once told me with a glass of wine in her hand, you stayed. That's all it ever came down to. And then came the knock at Harold's office. My children, after nearly 2 decades of silence, walked in as though summoned by some invisible signal. Daniel, Claire, and Michael, older now, polished, rehearsed. Their words were smoother, their gestures slower, but their eyes told the truth. They weren't there to reconnect. They weren't there to grieve with me. They were there because Margaret's name was now tied to mine, and with it came everything she had built. They asked about my health, my eating habits, the weight of the house, questions that sounded like care, but carried another meaning underneath. It struck me then with painful clarity. This wasn't reunion. This was strategy. Margaret had warned me in small ways that people rarely appear suddenly. They arrive with a plan. And as I sat across from my children, I felt the first stirrings of something new. Resolve. I wasn't the same woman they had cast out. Not anymore. When I returned home after the will reading, Harold handed me an envelope. My name was written on the front in Margaret's careful script. He said she had left instructions for me to open it privately. I placed it on the kitchen table, sat in her favorite chair, and let the silence of the house settle before I tore the flap open. The letter inside was brief, only 4 paragraphs, but every word felt like it had been chosen with surgical care. She began by acknowledging what she knew would happen, that my children would return. Not because they missed me, she wrote, but because grief has a way of stirring old regrets when money is involved. She warned me not to confuse guilt with trust, not to mistake their sudden presence for love. Forgiveness, she reminded me, was not the same as forgetting. I read those lines 3 times, her voice echoing in my head as though she were still in the room. Margaret had always been direct, practical. She didn't dress her warnings in soft words, and that was her gift. In her bluntness, I found clarity. There was a second envelope tucked in the back of the folder Harold gave me. On the outside, written in bold letters, were the words, "Open only if they come back." My hands trembled as I slid the paper out. It was dated 2 years before her passing. Margaret had anticipated this moment long before her final illness. Inside, she laid out steps. She had taken legal protections, trust clauses, ownership transfers that could not be reversed. She wrote that she had secured everything so I would not be forced to fight alone. But she also included something more piercing than the legal language. She said that people who abandon their parents rarely return out of love. They return when they think something can still be taken. She urged me to remember that unless actions match their words, I owed them nothing. I folded both letters and placed them in the locked cabinet near the fireplace. My chest ached, but my breathing steadied. Margaret was gone, but her clarity remained, like a compass she had left behind. For the first time since their return, I felt my footing again, and I promised myself I would not let their practiced smiles undo the years of strength she had helped me build. The days that followed were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like waiting for a storm. I knew my children would not stop with polite visits and soft words, and I was right. Within a week, Daniel appeared at my doorstep wearing a beige jacket, sleeves rolled neatly as if he had just left a meeting. His smile was polished, his tone rehearsed. He said he had been thinking about me, about how overwhelming managing Margaret's estate must feel. He offered his help, not as a son, but as someone positioning himself to take control. He used words like fair and reasonable, carefully chosen phrases that sounded generous but carried the weight of entitlement. A day later, Claire showed up. She brought flowers, bright yellow tulips, their edges already wilting. She stepped inside without waiting for me to invite her. Her voice was soft, her eyes damp with what might have been rehearsed tears. She spoke of second chances, of how maybe this tragedy could bring us back together. She said she had thought about me for years, that she missed me. Her words were tender, but her timing betrayed her. 18 years of silence does not dissolve overnight. Michael was different. He came last, standing awkwardly at the door, shifting from foot to foot. His voice was hesitant, his sentences halting. He said he never wanted things to turn out this way. He admitted they had seen the obituary, that it was Daniel who had pushed them to come. His eyes flickered with something that almost looked like shame. For a moment, I wanted to believe him, but belief is dangerous when history tells another story. I decided to test them. I asked Daniel to name the last book one had read before we stopped speaking. He faltered, then changed the subject. I asked Claire to describe my favorite meal. She guessed pot roast. It wasn't even close. I turned to Michael and asked him to look me in the eye. He tried, but his gaze dropped almost immediately, sliding back to the floor like it always had. The silence that followed told me everything. They weren't here for me. They weren't here because they had finally realized the cost of their absence. They were here because Margaret's estate had shifted the balance of power. Their sudden kindness was just another strategy, another plan drawn behind closed doors. And as I stood in my own living room, I realized something profound. I was not the woman who had walked out of her house 18 years ago with a single duffel bag. This time, I had the strength to stand my ground. It didn't take long for the next move to reveal itself. Daniel never thrived on patience. When charm failed, he shifted to pressure. One morning, Harold called me to his office. His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge under it. Daniel had hired a law firm, one that specialized in probate disputes, and filed a petition questioning my ability to manage Margaret's estate. In his statement, he suggested that grief had clouded my judgment, that perhaps I was too old, too emotional, too vulnerable to carry such a heavy responsibility. The words stung, but not because they were true. They stung because they came from my son. A boy I had once cradled through fevers and nightmares was now implying in court documents that I was unfit to decide my own future. Harold assured me we had nothing to fear, but fear wasn't the problem. Betrayal was. On the day of the hearing, I wore the same dark coat I had worn to Margaret's funeral. It still carried the faint scent of her lilac perfume, and I chose it because I needed to feel her strength beside me. The courthouse hallways echoed with footsteps and whispers, but inside the courtroom, everything slowed. Daniel's lawyer stood first, young, confident. Her voice was polished as she painted me as a fragile widow overwhelmed by grief. She mentioned the donations I had made to the women's shelter, the new writing program I had sponsored. She framed them as impulsive decisions, signs of instability. She never said the words old woman, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Then it was our turn. My attorney, Mr. Denning, a quiet man with sharp eyes, rose and spoke plainly. He listed my decades of steady work as an administrative coordinator, my spotless financial history, the meticulous records Margaret had left behind. He argued that competence was not measured by sorrow, but by clarity, and that I had demonstrated clarity at every step. And then he did something I hadn't expected. He called a witness, Marilyn Carter, the director of the shelter Margaret had funded for years. She walked forward in her jeans and blazer, not dressed to impress, but to stand firm. She spoke of how I had helped design programs, organize archives, and offered not just money, but structure and mentorship. She said I was a lighthouse, not a liability. The judge leaned back, weary eyes softening just slightly. He announced there was no legal ground to question my competence. The petition was dismissed. I had won. Yet, as Daniel avoided my gaze and walked out of that courtroom, I felt no triumph, only clarity. He had played his first card, and I knew more would follow. For a few days after the hearing, the house was still. No calls, no visits, no sudden knocks on the door. It should have felt like peace, but to me it felt like calculation, as if Daniel was retreating only to prepare his next move. And then one morning, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name typed neatly on a label. Inside was a photocopy of a financial spreadsheet. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary account record. Dates, numbers, signatures. But one of the signatures stopped me cold. It was mine. Or at least it was supposed to be. The document showed a transfer from an old trust, one that predated Margaret's will, into a secondary account. The date was 3 years ago, but I knew with certainty I had never signed that paper. My hand trembled as I traced the lines of ink. It wasn't just a question of inheritance anymore. This reached back further, deeper. The theft had begun long before Margaret died. I took the document straight to Harold. He examined it carefully, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then he looked at me with a heaviness I hadn't seen before. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, and likely not the work of one person. That night I sat alone at Margaret's desk, reading her old letters. I remembered her quiet warnings, the way she always insisted on keeping copies, the little notes she left in the margins of every folder. She must have suspected, she must have seen something in their behavior years ago. My chest ached with both sorrow and recognition. I had been so focused on surviving the present that I had failed to see the patterns forming beneath me. The next morning, I called a woman I trusted, Ashley Grant, a financial analyst I had met years earlier when Margaret funded a local foundation grant. Sharp-minded, unshaken by charm, Ashley agreed to look deeper. Within hours, she traced connections I could hardly believe. Daniel had opened multiple accounts under aliases, 2 already drained, 1 still holding close to $200,000, and the record suggested Michael had signed off on at least 1 transfer. I listened in silence, my heart steady, my jaw tight. This wasn't just betrayal born of desperation. It was architecture, planned, layered, years in the making. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't simply defending myself anymore. I was preparing to fight back.
The morning after Ashley handed me her findings, I brewed my coffee slowly and carried it to the porch. The air was cool, but inside I felt steady, almost sharpened. For years, I had lived with the quiet hope that one day my children might come back because they loved me. Now I knew the truth. They had been reaching into my life long before Margaret passed, not with love, but with forged signatures and hidden accounts. The illusion was gone, and in its place stood clarity. That afternoon, I went to the notary's office. I revoked any outdated documents, locked every trust under the care of an independent fiduciary group, and restructured the estate so that not one penny could be touched without oversight. I redirected funding for community projects, placing ownership and management into the hands of the women I had been mentoring. If my children ever tried again, they would find nothing left to pry open. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just surviving. I was building a fortress. When I returned home, the phone rang. Daniel's number lit up the screen. I answered only long enough to say one sentence. From now on, everything goes through legal channels. Then I hung up. It was the most silent goodbye I had ever given, and the cleanest. In the days that followed, I poured my energy into what mattered. I spent long afternoons at the women's shelter, helping organize their archives, encouraging new programs, listening to stories that mirrored my own in fragments. I created a scholarship in Margaret's name so her legacy would not be remembered in court filings, but in lives changed. And with each step, I felt myself loosening the grip of old wounds. My children's absence no longer defined me. My sister's presence still did. At night, I sat in the garden beneath the crooked lemon tree Margaret and I had once planted. I looked at its bent branches, stubborn but thriving, and saw myself reflected there, stronger, not because life had been gentle, but because it hadn't. The choice before me was simple. I could keep clinging to what was lost, or I could live fully in what remained. And I knew then I was done waiting at doors that had already been closed. The next chapter of my life would not be written by them, it would be written by me. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quieter, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of peace. I woke each morning without waiting for the phone to ring or the knock on the door. I brewed my coffee, walked the garden, and wrote in my leather notebook. Page by page, I recorded not just facts and accounts, but memories, reminders that my life was still mine to hold. One evening, I found myself sitting in the garden under the fading sun. The crooked lemon tree swayed in the breeze, its branches bent but full of fruit. I thought of Margaret, of her blunt wisdom and her quiet love. I thought of the women at the shelter, of their strength and resilience. And I thought of my children, not with anger, but with distance, the kind of distance that lets you breathe without pain. I realized then that I no longer needed their approval nor their apologies. What I needed was to live without waiting for the next door to close. So I began again. I planned a trip I had once only dreamed of, Maine in the fall, a place I had long wanted to see, not to escape, but to step into something new. For the first time in decades, the future felt wide enough for me. And as I packed my suitcase, I whispered the words Margaret once gave me. You stayed. That truth carried me further than anger ever could. I stayed. I endured. And now, finally, I chose myself. To those listening, I want to leave you with this. Sometimes love means letting go. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is protect your own peace. If you have ever faced someone who returned not out of love, but out of interest, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to choose yourself. If this story touched something inside you, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and join this community of voices who know what it means to endure. And if you believe in stories that heal as much as they reveal, please like this video and subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will help you write your own ending.